Gary is, Gary's a scientist, but other than considering him my friend, the thing I most respect about Gary is a spiritual seeker. And he has the courage to, and I think the resourcefulness to explore some of these nonlinear technologies that he's certainly involved in with his own body of work and with ours. And so when we were looking for somebody to help us quantify and standardize our way of vetting the service so that we can serve people whose minds may want that type of information so that they can relax into at least trying it. Gary was the guy that kept coming up. And so we're really glad to have you, Gary. Thank you for what you've done for us so far.
My privilege. Well, what's very special today is that we have major data that justifies your enthusiasm for all this and everybody else's. And it's a privilege to be able to share it. Would you like me to start?
Please.
Okay. So what I have to do to make sure that we've got this correct is get the right screen up, and we'll see whether this works. I say share. And once we do that, then we'll know that we're okay. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm. Looks good.
And
yes,
what we want to do is now also go back here to the beginning. Okay. I'd like to just make a couple of introductory remarks, if I might. First of all, by saying that I really want to thank Clayton and Jeff for and not only inspiring all of this, but making it possible to share all of this with people who really care about hearing it. And this today is a special day because it's the first time where I think you're going public with this initial stage of this work. So I want to honor that specialness. The second is that besides thanking everyone on the team, it's a really quite an extraordinary team doing extraordinary research. I'd also like to actually dedicate this to two people. One person is Professor William James from Harvard University, who lived over a century ago. And he was a physician and a philosopher who also bridged science and spirituality. And he was, so to speak, the grandfather of American psychology and a core leader in the birthing of psychology at a global level. And he was a hero of mine. In fact, I had the privilege to do my PhD in William James Hall, named after William James, at Harvard. And one of William James's many wonderful ideas was his devotion to what he called radical empiricism. And radical empiricism is the idea that you not be afraid to ask questions and then follow the data where it takes you. And I would like to honor him today because he's part of the inspiration for me to have the courage to do this kind of work. The other person I'd like to honor is someone whose name is Miles Stegman, who people in FLE know well. Miles has been an inspiration for ongoing research with the research team, particularly the plant research. And he suddenly, I think probably for most of us, unexpectedly transitioned a few weeks ago. And although he may have passed on, he has not passed away. And I am honored in part to be able to share this with his consciousness clearly in my mind and heart. And I hope for some of you, his as well. Okay, So let's talk about, first of all, what do we mean by the gold standard in these what we call 4 phases of research? And very briefly, phase 1 research is, and I should explain, by the way, that these phases have been used in various ways by various organizations, including, for example, biomedical research and also psychological research involving treatment outcomes. And it can easily be applied to any area, including any kind of service work. And in phase 1 research, you're doing exploratory research. It's typically small scale, but it can have even large numbers. And it addresses the question, does carefully collected user evidence suggest that a given service works? In other words, do people actually reporting things that are beneficial to them? It doesn't tell us how it works, but it justifies then seeking further research. Now, if positive findings are obtained, then we have phase 2 research, which is confirmatory and parametric research, typically also small scale, addressing the question, do laboratory and controlled experiments support the user evidence and also verify safety? Now, if positive findings are obtained here, which includes, by the way, working on understanding how it works as opposed to that it works, then we move on to what's called phase 3 research. Now, this is very large scale research, typically in, for example, the pharmacological industry or in other large scale service providers, where you address the question, do controlled multi-center, multi-blinded randomized controlled trials replicate the phase 2 experiments in terms of efficacy and safety? And then if positive findings are obtained here, then some people do what's called phase 4 research, where you have real life validation experiments, typically large scale, addressing the question, are positive findings obtained observing in the phase 3 research replicated in large scale usage in real life? Because sometimes, for example, something can be observed when you do research on it, but then the effects are different when it's observed in real life. And FLFE, as a visionary company, has the potential with these goals in mind to be able to address all 4 types of research in an ever spiraling, evolving kind of way. Now, FLFE customers provide a wealth of spontaneous accounts of positive experiences with FLFE on the FLFE website as well as on the Facebook page. By the way, can you see my cursor? Is that on the screen?
Yes.
That's wonderful, because then I can point. So what were the 4 purposes of this retrospective phase 1 research? Purpose number 1 was to develop an instrument, which we call the Customer Experience Survey, that can easily and effectively assess frequently reported benefits of FLFE. Now think about this. Where are these FLFE benefits coming from? They're being reported by users. This is user-generated, experience-generated research. It is the claims that you who are listening make as you've been on the service. Purpose 2 is to evaluate the degree of benefits in a representative sample of FLFE customers using a validated scale. Purpose number 3 is to explore the replicability of the degree of positive effects from FLFE as a function of gender or age and years of FLFE participation. That was the first step in this work. And then finally, purpose 4 is to examine the relationship between expectation of benefits from less than expected to more than expected and degrees of positive experiences reported, which you'll see was added in step 7 below. Now, one of the things I should say is that when you engage in radical empiricism, when you work at the frontiers, when you're willing to follow the data where it takes you, one of the great lessons is to be prepared for surprises. It's also part of the great fun of being a seeker, seeking information. And you're going to see there are a couple of, I would say, extraordinary surprises that are about to be revealed. Okay. So let me give you the summary of the 4 findings so that you can see the big picture, and then we're going to take you through each one in what they call the deep dive. So you're going to see lots of scientific data plus data that's been restructured by Maria and also Paula to make it easy for us to be able to see and understand. So the findings for purpose one is that the CES, the Customer Experience Survey, was found to be successful in easily and effectively assessing frequently reported FLFE customer experiences. We succeeded in doing that. Then findings for purpose two, the majority of FLFE customers report high rates of positive experiences across each of the 16 individual benefits that comprise the questionnaire we developed, replicating and extending spontaneous testimonials. Findings for purpose number three is that these positive findings, importantly, were replicated across age, gender, and years using FLFE, with a slight proviso there, you'll see. And findings for purpose number four is that the majority of FLFE customers reported that the benefits of FLE were greater than they expected. Think about this. You who are filled out these questionnaires ended up indicating that for many of you, your experiences were greater than you expected. And these individuals also reported the highest levels of positive experiences with FLFE. So, what were the 8 steps we used for creating pilot testing and conducting the FLFE CES Phase 1 research? Briefly, step 1, approximately 4 years of spontaneous accounts of benefits were entered in verbatim into an Excel spreadsheet. Then 2 word frequency account analyses were performed and word cloud graphs were examined to see how the content and concepts were structured. 3, a set of frequently reported benefits were selected by senior FLFE members and carefully crafted into questions that were easy to read and rate. Step 4, additional questions regarding expectations, age, gender, and time using FLFE were created for a total of 20 questions. Then in step 5, we did a pilot experiment, the first one of 5 people. The original CES one was taken by 5 executives and senior FLFE staff members under 2 conditions. First, the items were rated based on their own personal experiences with FLFE. And 2, items were rated again based on their predictions regarding how representative consumers would answer the questions. In the process, improvements in the wording specific benefits were made. So you do an initial pilot study. Then we did a second pilot study with a larger N, N of 14. The modified CES, which is number 2, is then beta tested using FLFE staff. Additional modifications of wording and questions were made as indicated. Then step number 3, we did a pilot study with N of 52 people. Now that's already starting to move into something that we can draw decent conclusions about, is something working. This version was announced on the FLFE website and answered by approximately, as he said, 52 customers. After analyzing the data, it was decided to add the expectation question and also create 6 subcategories of benefits to make it easier to grok or understand the information in terms of physical items, mental items, emotional, personal, social, nature, and spiritual. And then step A, we now have a representative retrospective phase 1 study, total of 338 people filled out all these questions. So now it's on Facebook, and from there we have this data. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to include graphs that you'll see in the summaries of the quick look that Maria has so beautifully reported, but then give you the scientific data and the detailed graphs that show how these summary graphs were made. So you can see, for example, it's very easy to tell that using the 4 categories of under 20, age 21 to 40, age 41 to 60, and age 61 to 90, you can look at the color coding and you can see what the approximate percentage or numbers of people were in each category. So there's a fairly large distribution of age. You can also see in terms of males and females that the females were clearly more represented than males, which is, I think, my understanding of that's the way the service is in general. Now, what were the 16 items and the 6 subcategories of FLFE reported benefits? So I'm going to take you through each of the items so you can think about how you experienced these, the degree to which you experienced them. And they were rated, by the way, from 1, which essentially was never or not at all, to 5, which is very often. And we were talking about frequency of noticing these changes. For the physical items, we have how often have you experienced more physical energy? And A second one is how often have you experienced more restful sleep? These numbers over here are actually where the questions fell in the order that they were presented and that you filled them out, as opposed to the questionnaire didn't present them in this order, which means they were, quote, scrambled. Mental items, by contrast, were how often have you experienced more mental clarity? And how often have you experienced that it's easier to notice a negative thought and move it to a more positive thought? This item becomes very important because it was also one of the most frequently reported benefits. Then in the emotional category, we have 3 items. How often have you noticed more joy, laughter, or fun for those in the FLFE environment? 9, how often have you experienced a relief from anxiety? And the 12 here was, how often have you noticed that it's easier to find forgiveness? Again, one that I was surprised that came up so frequently in terms of experience change. I say I was surprised because I wasn't thinking of this in terms of high consciousness fields, because that becomes a prediction. Then we have personal and social items. How often have you noticed improvements in communication among those around you in the FLFE environment? How often have you noticed more ease and flow in everyday life? How often have you noticed positive changes in overall quality of life? How often have you noticed engaging less in perceived bad habits? How often have you experienced breakthroughs or seen bigger life changes? And again, I remind you, where did these items come from? They came from you. This is all based on your spontaneous testimonials, which we then formalize in an instrument. Then we have 2 items that relate to nature, which I have a pet interest in, no pun intended, which is how often have you noticed the change in the vitality or growth of your houseplants, which of course requires that you have houseplants if you're going to see a change. And then how often have you noticed the presence of abundant wildlife beyond what you normally experienced? Again, it helps if you're living out in the country or have abundant wildlife that could appear. And finally, spiritual, some of you, and many of you may be particularly interested in this, I happen to be one of those people. How often have you experienced easier or deeper meditations or feel more connected overall? And finally, how often have you seen or experienced more synchronicities of any kind that hold relevance to you personally? So those are the 16 items. So now we're going to get to like numbers. Okay. Purpose number 1, is the 16-item CES a reliable instrument? And one of the ways scientists check reliability is they look to see to which a given item is correlated with other items in an instrument. So you see we have 16 items going across here in the order that they occurred. These are the rows, well, down. So these are the columns. And then there are rows. And of course, the rows are also the items. Now, what is a correlation? A correlation is the extent to which 2 sets of numbers are related to each other. And the maximum they can be related is 100%, perfection, which in statistics terms is called a 1. If there's no relationship, the number is a 0. And if they're inversely related, they're out of phase, for example, you have a -1. So the numbers range from -1 to +1. Now you'll notice all these 1s down here in the darker number. The reason is that when an item is correlated with itself, it better be perfect. This is one of the ways you know your statistics program is working, is that the item correlates well with itself. Once you know it correlates well with yourself, then you can look to see whether, to what extent do people who report increase in physical energy, do they report increase in mental clarity or joy or fun or restful sleep and so on. And the thing that's amazing about these data is that the numbers are all typically above 50.5, and they go up to 0.7, even to 0.8. These numbers are highly statistically significant. So every item correlates with every other item. So if you want to create an instrument of overall perceived benefit, it passes one of the first criteria for looking at. Now, you can do this in a more sophisticated way by looking at, for example, what's called split half reliability and something called for example, the Cronbach's alpha. And again, this number can be from 0 to 0.1. Anything that's typically around 0.8 or so, you're really quite happy with. the CES was 0.969, which is really excellent for an instrument to justify its use. And if you also look at the what's called split half reliability, looking in terms of the first and second set half of the items, and you look at what's called the Gutman split half reliability or other measures, you see they're clearly above 9, anywhere from 9.5 to 9.7. So we have some confidence now in knowing that, at least in terms of the internal consistency of the scale that we created, that it holds together sufficiently well to justify using it to assess people's experiences. You also want to look at when we create the subscales, or when we talked about physical, mental, emotional, personal, nature, and spiritual, and we again have the columns and the rows, again, everything's correlated with everything, which, by the way, had better be the case if each of the individual items were correlated with each other. And so again, this provides further consistency and confidence. So we now move on to purpose number 2. Do a majority of respondents report positive benefits with FLFE? And the answer is clearly yes. If we take the items, and the ratings, as you know, are from none or minimal, which are numbers of 1 and 2, or some items, some benefit, which is a rating of 3, versus a substantial benefit, which is a rating of 4 and 5. And then you classify each person in terms of their average rating across the 16 items. You can see that 57.86%, i.e. around 58% of people report substantial benefits, 23.48% report some benefits, and only 18.7% report no or minimal benefits. So if you were looking to see whether some or substantial benefits, you're talking about more than 80% of the people the 338 people who answered this question reported positive benefits. Now, of course, you would think that people who would care enough to fill out a questionnaire are going to be people who care about FLFE and might report positive benefits. The fact that we see a clear, small, but nonetheless representative sample of people reporting minimal or no benefits gives us confidence that the data are real. Because nothing works for everyone. And also, there are other factors why people might not report benefits if benefits are there to be found. For example, you get habituated to good things and then you stop noticing them. It's a standard phenomena that many people experience. So all of this suggests we want to do more research. And this is a plot of those means. And I want you to look at the shape of this curve because this shape is repeated over and over again. So for example, by the way, like Clayton and Jeff, I really love data. And so when I get into data, and I like to look at it thoroughly and completely. So in my quote, I would say obsessive seeking of information from data, not wanting to waste a single possible gem, and honoring the fact that people have given their time and energy into filling out these questionnaires, I will analyze, and I'm just displaying how the data came out. So look at this. This is a plot of the average for every single item. All 16 items are individually plotted on this graph. Excel is so nice because it makes it much prettier than my statistics packages. But anyway, you can see that every item shows this general effect. This is a pattern that shows for every single item. So we know that whatever this effect is, and it's clearly there, it's something that is highly repeated across the items. Now, purpose 3, do the majority of respondents reporting positive benefits replicate across gender? The answer is clearly yes. When we split them, the subjects into male, people who reported being males versus people who reported being females, there were other people who didn't report their gender, so didn't include them. You can see that both males and females show the identical trend. So this is not just due to female participants with FLFE. This is, for the sample as a whole, applies to both men and women. Purpose number 3 also, do the majority of respondents reporting positive benefits replicate across age? The answer is yes. So here I have 5 age groups, which I originally separated into the categories of less, 33 years or less, 34 to 45, 34 to 44, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, and above 65. And you can just say, why did I do that? When we had the earlier one where only 4 age groups. And the reason is because I was attempting to split the data so that we had fairly comparable and large numbers in each of the groups. So going up to age 33, we had an N of 30. And then getting to the next category, we have an N of 61. So these are sufficiently large enough that each of the curves are valid. And notice, irrespective of age, the effects are the same. So older people get benefit, not just younger people, old in Earth years. Okay, purpose number 3 again. Do the majority of respondents reporting positive benefits replicate across length of using FLFE? Yes, with a minor exception here. Now, plotting the data this way is not the clearest way to see the results, as you'll see when Maria does her beautiful ways of integrating the data. But if you split people into less than 3 months, 3 months to 12 months, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, or greater than 3 years, which are these 5 groups, and you can see that less than 3 months, the N was 121, whereas 3 to 12 months was N of 107. The smallest group was greater than 3 years, that is filling out the sample, and not surprising, N of 30. You can see all 4 groups show this effect. They show the same trend, but one group showed a much smaller trend here. And that's the group that were less than 3 months. So the less than 3 months group are showing some effects, not as large as what happens when you go from 3 months to 1 year. Now, again, before we jump to any conclusions about interpretation, right now we're just in the radical empiricism. We're looking at the data. Later, we can talk about, well, how might we explain these data? What else would we do to be able to replicate, to be sure that these data are in fact the right, are an accurate generalization, and so on. So I share these results. Now, these are the same data, but replotted by Maria. And you can see here now, what's called the y-axis is the percent scores, and on the x-axis we now have years in the service. And it's very easy to see that as you go along in the service, most people are reporting obviously the high benefits, and then you've got some benefits here, and it really trails off by the time you get 3 years in terms of people not reporting anything. Again, we're not putting an interpretation on this, but you can also see that this is where the first 3 months, but it's just a beautiful curve. It's aesthetically pretty, and the data are also really nice. Okay, now purpose number 4. Can the expectation of FLFE effectiveness explain the experience of FLFE benefits? In other words, if we were going to go from is something happening to the first question that anyone wants to ask, whether you're a skeptic or not. But if you're a true seeker and you want to know why is this happening, you want to know whether or not is people's expectations what determines the outcome. So we included, because this was a retrospective study, we included an item where people filled out whether the results that they experienced were less than expected, or were the results the benefits that they experienced as they anticipated, or were they greater than expected? And I, as someone who is, if you would, the person who's supposed to approach all of this with as little pre-bias or pre-experience as possible, so I can look at the data afresh. I, for one, and I think many others were surprised that the people who reported that the effects were greater than they expected when they started the program, that represents 2/3 of the people who reported. Which means what? A, they couldn't have had very high expectations, because if they had very high expectations, it couldn't have been greater than expected. And again, we don't know because we didn't collect those data, but you could be sure we will in the next survey as we progress in the research. You really want to be able to get what the pre-values are starting ahead of time, as opposed to memory, to see how that relates to outcome. But the only way you can get these results is if many people were unsure about whether the results were positive or negative. So there could be some room for surprise. And if you notice here, not only were 2/3 of the sample were the results greater than expected, and a good 17% were as expected, but only about 16% of the people reporting who filled out the questionnaire reported it as being less than the expected. And if you look now at their ratings of perceived benefits, in this case, on each of the subscales, the physical, the mental, emotional, personal, nature, and spiritual, i.e., these are 6 categories as opposed to all 16 items, you can see the results as clear as day. The people who were where the findings were greater than expected, their perceived benefits, they were the people who reported the highest benefits. Mm. So if you're going to be surprised, isn't it nice to be surprised with strongly positive benefits? Okay. Now, these are the same data regraphed by Maria. And of course, they're really easy to see it in this fashion. But people have more, these are the real numbers now from which these graphs were then created. So now you have access to both of those graphs. Now, this gets to be a little complicated, but I was told that enough of you who are listening want to get into a nitty-gritty, so that I'll give you at least one thing that's a little complicated so you can ponder this. And that is, can expectation of FLFE effectiveness explain experience of FLFE benefits? Again, I say no. Again, we've seen the same value ratings that we said before in terms of the percentage here. But now what I want to do is I want to graph these in terms of people who reported minimal and no benefits, some benefits, or substantial benefits. Now, if we look at the group which was greater than expected, you'll notice that over 80% of these people reported clearly substantial benefits. Another 12% reported some benefits, and virtually none of them reported no benefits, or minimal or no benefits. Not surprisingly, the people who are who experienced things less than expected, the predominance of these people reported minimal benefits. And some of them reported, obviously, some benefits, but relatively few reported, now this is a very small n, reported only minimal benefits. If it was as was expected, notice the peak is in the middle. It's where it's either less on either substantial or minimal. These are the data. They look complicated until you explain them. But they're, again, they, quote, make sense. And this is just the summary, remembering that these items are all highly reliable, but these break into this when we look at in a more sophisticated fashion. Now, here's the last bit of data, and I was really surprised again about this. What happens if we rank order the items in terms of items where people reported the least benefits for those that were reporting the most benefits? We look at the items and see how they line up. Is there any trend? Is there any pattern? Is there any structure? Is it teaching us anything about FLFE? And I plotted them separately for those who reported where the benefits were greater than expected, and then I'll show you the other two, as expected and then below expected. Notice, sort of not surprisingly, the average was least reported for abundant wildlife and vital plants. But again, if you don't have plants, you're not going to see many changes. And if you don't have a lot of wildlife. So unless you have data about people's locales and the number of plants they have in their house, you can't interpret this number. But what is interesting here is restful sleep and physical energy. People did not report as highly benefits. I mean, clearly they're reporting benefits, but it's not nearly as high as the items that were the most stellar. And those most stellar of highest items, which I will emphasize here, is improvement in overall quality of life, capacity to express forgiveness, and the ease of shifting from negative to positive thoughts and actions. This is the kind of change that I think many people would like in their lives. Now, the question is this pattern only present if you have benefits that are greater than expected? So, of course, you know me now, I had to look at the data. Anyway, here's the data. Now, again, the scale is lower. So these numbers are lower, obviously. 3 is as you know, the moderate range for experiencing positive symptoms. But look at the graph. The shape is virtually identical. Abundant and relief of anxiety and breakthroughs are down here. Physical energy is still down here. And notice what's highest up here: forgiveness, negative to positive. Quality of life is down a little bit more. Improved communication is up here. But the general trend of these items is very similar. If we now look at the people where the benefits were less than expected, I think this needs to be reversed. Anyway, you'll notice here the ratings are now lowest. Again, abundant wildlife, physical energy, interesting, joy and fun are lower. But look what's up here again, highest again. Even among people who reported benefits less than what they expected, forgiveness and negative to positive, and also deep meditation was up there. So there is some pattern here yet to be understood, which may make sense to some of you, which is telling us there's something real going on here. Now, again, we can thank Maria for this, but she's plotted it in a much cleaner and prettier way for this total sample as a whole. So you can see that for all the people together, forgiveness, negative, positive, and deeper meditation, you can see this are clearly the highest compared to the lowest. And that's a very aesthetically pretty and also intellectually pretty graph. Finally, she's created a graph here where every single item in the order that they were filled out is listed in terms of less than, as expected, or better than expected. So you can see the whole thing in one clear graph. So what are the conclusions that we can reach from this phase 1 retrospective exploratory is something happening data set? What can we draw from this? Conclusion number 1. It is possible to measure 16 commonly reported benefits from FLFE using a standardized questionnaire or survey. Conclusion number 2, the majority, as we said, 58% approximately of respondents in a relatively large sample. We say relatively large sample because that's a lot of people. It's not a huge number in terms of the total customer base of FLFE, but it's large for an initial exploratory phase 1 experiment for this work. Report experiencing these benefits, an additional approximately 23% report experiencing some benefits. Only 18.66% of the respondents report minimal or no benefits. Conclusion number 3, these substantial effects are replicated across genders and ages. They're also replicated across people experiencing the FLF service for 3 months or longer, extending beyond 3 years. That's clearly the case. Conclusion number 4, these substantial experience benefits cannot be explained as being a simple placebo effect. This is not just if you believe you're going to have, it's more than belief. The majority, 67% approximately the respondents reported that their experience of benefits were greater than they expected, implying that they were surprised by these positive observations and experiences. Only 7.5% reported that the FLFE events were as they expected, while 15.97% indicated the effects were less than they expected. And therefore, conclusion number 5 altogether, the findings from this large-scale retrospective phase 1 experiment support the claim made by customers that FLFE is having positive effects for a majority of users, and that phase 2 research, i.e. to do the kind of research that gets at mechanisms of action and gets at the conditions for optimally getting effects and so on, that doing this kind of research, extending this research, including how FLFE works, is justified. FLFE provides a summary conclusion. I'm not even going to give you that soundbite here. I think I'm going to close this down for reasons that I would like to explain. And then I will pass the baton back to Clayton and Jeff, who have been very patient listening to this evidence. And that is that unless one collects systematic data on the very foundation of a service, which is whether people are experiencing positive benefits or not, there is little justification for doing more extensive research or in trying to understand how it works. Particularly when, in order to understand how it works, you have to integrate things that, quote, go outside the box of conventional thinking. And therefore, putting the time and energy into quantifying the people's experiences and becoming clear about that it's truly fundamental. And I'm very proud that FLFE is committed to that purity of effort and that foundational of effort. And also, for those of you who are hearing this, who either yourself are skeptical, and it's good to be skeptical. To be a seeker is to ask questions. So skeptical is wonderful, to be asking questions. But in the future, since the people who you know might think, well, maybe you're a little odd, so what the heck are you doing thinking about this stuff and participating in this? You can now say, well, you know, they're actually collecting data on the fundamental nature of the idea that there's something real here. And if you go to the website or you watch this webinar, you can find out. And so if this helps you in terms of your living trying to live a more evolved life and grow and help your loved ones, the people you know, be with you on this journey as well, then hopefully these data will be of that service.